Good evening, everyone. It's just turned 5:30. A wonderful and warm welcome to everyone who could make it in person. We also greet everyone online. Welcome to the fourth installment of the OSC GBV Indaba, entitled Defining What Men Do Differently and Implications for Male Residents at UCT. We are excited, as you can see, to have UCT staff who are student housing practitioners, inclusivity specialists. We also have student leaders with a focus specifically on engaging male students at UCT on the experiences of being, as well as gaining insight on how we can tailor our institutional responses, services, and programs to better address the psychosocial needs of our young male students at UCT as a means to address GBV on our campus and to foster an environment where healthy masculinities are encouraged and nurtured. Our keynote speaker, I think I'm very excited to have our keynote speaker with us. We'll engage in pertinent issues to understand the complex contemporary context. This includes challenges and competing interests that young males in the diverse personalities navigate, specifically in the context of a university, right? Simply put, we place emphasis on exploring what we need to know as university personnel about our male students. What is possible for the university to do, and also what are areas that need attention and review, and what our limitation is. I think it's pertinent that we also ask some additional questions. This space allows for us to do that. Is the university able to effectively do masculinity work in the extracurricular space or the co-curricular space in the absence of organic social structures? Is there a universal masculinity that can be imparted on male students that resonates across religions, cultures, and socioeconomic status? And what are the risks to consider as a university doing masculinity in the extracurricular space? We also have opportunity today to engage, I think, in our breakaway sessions, a couple of questions at 3 levels: a strategic level, programmatic level, and also ideas around capacity development, right? So without further ado, I have the privilege of introducing you to our very own Professor Divine Fu, an exceptional mind that has taught in and engaged with various contexts globally, as you will soon hear. I read from a small bio. Professor has joined the University of Cape Town in 2012 from the University of Basel in Switzerland, where he was a senior researcher or lecturer in the chair for Research and Methodology, Institute for Sociology. He coordinates the research group Fixing the City, with research interests in youth, masculinities, aspirations, precarity, agency, entrepreneurship, financial inclusion, popular culture, and sustainability. His research examines the ways in which people seek ways of smiling in the midst of suffering, focusing on cities, precarity or uncertainty, agency, and the quest for stability and human dignity. A mouthful, but important to cover. Critically examining aspirations, hope, happiness, and becoming. His current publications on youth and upcoming books engage with the basic question of how youth in African cities cope with the many challenges that the weakness of the state, the economy, and the many aspects of ongoing processes of globalization provokes. It explores how urban youth develop new modes of agency that allows them to maintain an active attitude despite the permanent difficulties of finding a place in society that apparently does not have one for them. He is also a graduate of the Swiss postgraduate program in ethnology and anthropology, holds a BSc honors in journalism and mass communication and political science from the University of Ville in Cameroon, an MA in development studies from the University of Botswana, and a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Basel in Switzerland. He has taught at the University of Basel in Switzerland, Western Cape and Stellenbosch in South Africa, Brasilia in Brazil, and the University of Tokyo in Japan. He has been a visiting fellow at the Center for Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin, Germany, and the African Studies Center in Leiden, the Netherlands. He has served as a consultant for several international organizations and has been editorial assistant for several journals, including being founding managing editor for Langa Research and Publishing CIG. He's a member of the Future Water Institute and the Minerals to Metals Initiative at the University of Cape Town. I think a very powerful CV, but also an indication of the wealth of expertise and knowledge of the context, having served in so many spaces. A very warm welcome to you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Quinton. And also thank you very much to all the colleagues at the OIC um, for inviting me. And also the colleagues who have joined us. This is a very ungodly hour of discussion at the end of a very long day, and for some of us parents, the day doesn't end, it starts very early, so some of us have been up since 4 o'clock, wake up in the morning, prepare a few things, prepare the kids, take them, drop them off to school, come back, and then you might get beaten up by students, and then after that you get beaten up by colleagues, and then you still have to meet up with all other obligations, and then you continue to smile, because the way in which our academic context is framed today, professors are supposed to be very good entertainers, always smile and always be happy, because if you miss your smile, it might be the end of your career. But thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not an expert on GBV. That's very important, to note. I'm not an expert on GBV. I don't think I'm an expert on many things. I think I'm an expert on myself. But even then, I have to discover myself on a daily basis. So, I have done work on youth and masculinities, which is something that's very passionate, or I find really important and really critical. I always tell people that when I did my studies, my bachelor's degree at the University of Buea in Cameroon, that was just after Beijing and the creating centers of women's studies. If you did women's studies, you were considered as somebody who was lost at that time, because women's studies was these people who wanted to create problems for everyone else, and everyone else meaning men, a very patriarchal society. So I did political science. Those who did political science were highly respected, Some of us who did a little bit of journalism were thought about the noisemakers, So, but when I went to the University of Botswana, I met one of my mentors and supervisors, Polisam Mukodi, who got me to start doing research on gender, but really focused on masculinities. And I started doing work on men's sexual expression within the context of HIV. And Botswana had highest, not in terms of numbers, but ratio in terms of the population, and the frequency of infection was very high. It was 1 out of every 3 persons at that time who was infected by HIV. Everybody was trying to understand and to mitigate, the circumstances. And at that time, there was something called ABC, And I don't know if the people who grew up today understand what ABC is, but some of us were tortured with ABC. Also because a lot of the funding for HIV came from the US, and President Bush, who was invading Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places at that time, was also a particular kind of Christian conservative. And you had to abstain, that was abstinence. B, what was B again? Be faithful. You had to abstain. And if you could not abstain, you should be faithful to a partner. And lastly, you had to condomize. So, and I recall when I was arrived in Botswana and went on a walk, the first thing I saw was lots of condoms across the street, as I walked, get my walk. But what was fascinating is that these condoms did not have semen. So there were lots of condoms, but the condoms did not have semen. So I became very curious. What happens? Why is it that there's so many condoms on the street, but these condoms don't have semen. So it pushed me to begin to ask the context under which condoms were being asked to be used, and whether it was possible actually at that time to actually follow these recommendations or requirements, because when one looks at how love and other encounters happen, sex is not just the activity that happens in love relationship. It happens in so many different ways. Yeah. One night stands, people go to bars, lots of other things that happen. In fact, when I moved to Europe, the first thing I learned is that you could just meet somebody, sleep today, and tomorrow you don't know each other. So it doesn't only happen within the context of love. It happens outside of love. So there was a push for people to remain, not get drunk, not drink, because alcohol was said to be responsible, and then traditions and customs were said to be responsible, but particularly African traditions and customs. So, and at this time, black men in particular were set to have a problem. And the HIV rate, because I began to ask, so what is it? They said risky behaviors. Risky behavior, because risky behaviors defines what masculinity is. And the men during this period were saying, on the one side, because of tradition, custom, and values that are attached to particular things, which includes how women are framed in that custom. Women are framed as people who have to obey what men say. So the power dynamics, in those relationships. So men must impose, and women would, and that because of powerlessness, lots of women could not make decisions around sex in those relationships. But custom was on the one side to blame. On the other side, they blamed modernity because of certain aspirations and what modernity had offered to people. And in blaming modernity, lots of young men were beginning to have new ideas about what it meant to become a successful man. And part of this was really to embed themselves in machismo and macho behaviors. And men were seen to be dangerous in society. They were seen to be dangerous for women, and they were seen to be dangerous for the world. But not just men, young men in particular were seen to be very dangerous. Of course, there were other discussions like intergenerational relationships, where there was a time when it was all about sugar daddies, and also, they shifted to sugar mommies, but that wasn't allowed, but it was the prerogative of these men. So, because those came into play, there is another concept called patriarchy, as patriarchs, because of this entire system, which is the rule of men, the rule particularly of fathers and elderly men, they were really taking advantage of the privileges and advantages that they have in this system, which is a power privilege, to really unleash lots of dangerous behaviors, within the space, but also because growing up depends on mentoring. Women were learning from other women that they needed to be submissive, and men were learning from other men that they needed to dominate others. But this was the context under which sex was happening. I was interested in sex and how sex happens, and I just wanted to know, so when do you wear the condom, So when you come back and you had a lot of alcohol, and you start a heteronormative relationship where it's happening, because when HIV started, the first thing is that they started blaming particularly gay men, and that this was a disease of gay men. And then after that, there's always someone to blame. They always peel the onion and they reduce it and reduce it until they say, no, it's women, then it's men. But heteronormative relationships were particularly responsible, or said to be responsible for proliferating this infection. But heteronormative relationship involving black men, and particularly black men and black women. So I really wanted to understand how the risky behavior happens. So when you start and you're excited and then you just arrive, have a drink and you go to the bedroom and then you start and then you say condom. And then you have to start looking for a condom, and I was trying to understand all these debates about rationality, and choice, and whether it was really possible and whether people could act as machines, because it required that you must always be sane at every given period. At the end of the day, I said, I think the problem is not just about masculinity. It is that in the process, what we have done is to create masculinity as a pathology. Masculinity has become a pathology. And I also want to still argue that masculinity is a pathology, but it's a particular kind of pathology. And to do that, I'm going to try to raise a number of things, but I first wanted to illustrate that by starting with the case of women, which I think today is the anniversary of that brutality that happened in August, I think, 2019. I was in Senegal then on a leave of absence and following that story. But this was quite a painful story, but painful in many different ways. The way it was painful is also how it happened. That you had someone who was living in a neighborhood and went to their neighborhood to pick up a parcel. You should not be afraid of your neighborhood. You should not be afraid of the post office. And even worse, you should not be afraid of any other person. If you meet another person, particularly another male, when I came to this country, I learned about Date, I learned about Dada, I learned about Buti, and that these are all people who, even when embedded in patriarchy, are supposed to look after you. So, and that's why I'm saying that masculinity is a pathology. Patriarchy is bad, but patriarchy is not necessarily violent. So, but masculinity is essentially violent. And in this particular case, you find that being a particular kind of person makes you a constant target. You live the world as a target. You experience the world as a target. So, and in this particular case, I want to start narrowing down as a black person. It's not just any kind of black person. It's a black woman. It's not just any kind of black woman. It's a young black woman, and also it's a young black woman who is walking alone. So all of this should not be a problem. When I go to Sea Point, I see lots of people walking alone now, late in the night at 9 p.m. I go to many neighborhoods, I see lots of people walking alone. Very late at night, it doesn't mean that things have happened, but it's just that why is it that it's a particular kind of person, a particular kind of experience and identity that really experiences this kind of violation. And I think that's what makes this particular case very, very peculiar and also very sad. And what is sad about it is that all of what happens is supposed to be something that we should consider exceptional. But sadly, it's not exceptional. So it is a story that reproduces itself over and over and over. So something that we recognize and we can acknowledge. And I think that is really where we have a challenge and what to do with it, and also how to do with it. And every time it happens, there's a lot of protests, there's a lot of statements, there's a special commission that is done. People have to spend the next days and the next days reminding themselves this is happening, this is happening. but it still happens and it goes on. And this is just the case of those that we know. The crime statistics for the last quarter of this year actually shows that educational institutions have become crime scenes. Because the amount of murders that are happening in those spaces, and even in kindergartens and creches, these spaces have become crime scenes, and that's quite problematic, because educational institutions are particular kinds of spaces, and also they are founded along monastic principles, and monastic principles which also pay very high value to to morality. But education institutions have become crime scenes, and that is something that we have to think very, very seriously about. How did we turn education institutions? How do we turn the world into a crime scene? But how did we turn education institutions into crime scenes? So I want to really hold that we reflect a little bit around that as we are talking about GBV, and men, because the question here is what men can do. That's the question. What men can do, and I was laughing earlier that telling my brother Munene, who got me trapped in this talk. He was looking for a victim, and I was, to do this talk. I was telling Munene, the kinds of challenges that we face, that we talk about what men can do about GBV is also a talk that is especially attended by women, and that already tells you the challenge that we have, because the kinds of conversations and the kinds of spaces that this conversation should happen, and who takes up this conversation. We've created a society in which the victim is always the person who has to resolve the issue, and it's at all levels. So if you look at racial politics in South Africa, it is the victim that has to resolve the issue. If you look at GBV, it is the victim that has to resolve the issue. So we created a society and a world in which the burden is always on the victim. The victim has to protect themselves, and the victim has to try to be safe, the victim has to try to do this. So, and this is quite a really serious challenge, and it runs through. So it's not just in GBV, it's not just with women, it's not just with gender relations. It is across the entire spectrum. So if we're going to solve it just by picking up gender relation without looking at other places where this is reproduced, we're actually making a big mistake, because I was reading recently that since the TRC happened, no one has been prosecuted, or if at all, a few people are, or even if prosecuted or locked up for the crime that was declared as a crime against humanity. So across the system, you can see that it's reproducing itself in so many different ways, and that's something that we need to really think about as a systemic issue. But I see, is that 5 minutes left? Okay, because I was told that if I see 5 minutes, it's handy. So, yeah. But I want to try to resolve this by focusing on two specific things. One is masculinity itself. And I think that we cannot fix masculinities. That masculinities is a concept that is essentially problematic. That once you deploy masculinities, you already mean that it is a problem that you cannot fix. So even the concept itself of toxic masculinity for me is a tautology, because masculinity is essentially problematic. It's a concept for me that is born really with HIV, because that's when it really emerges as an explanation for the stuff that is happening. And they say, why are we having a high HIV rate? Masculinity. So it's a problem. And I think it's a particular kind of manhood and a particular kind of being man. It's not that manhood is good. It's just that masculinity is a sub-type that needs to end. and it's not a subtype that you can fix. You know, what needs to happen is to adapt. I think there's one of these shows. I think it's Battlestar Galactica, which has this downloadable consciousness that you can always download, change your consciousness, you know, and download. And I think that's something we really have to critically consider. What we need to really focus on shifting is patriarchy itself, and understanding the ways in which patriarchy manifests itself. Masculinity is just one, but masculinity has taken so much also because of the virility violation. I think we can understand and shift and change patriarchy, but I think masculinity is essential. And masculinity for me is a kind of an identity that, a particular kind of subject position, which is for me created to serve neoliberal capitalism. That is essentially what it is. That it is born and created, and its sole purpose is really to function in a modern world and modern society. Because what happens is that you have to transform the men that we have. Because remember, the entire colonial project is to make new people. And in the case of South Africa, it's quite unique. Not that, I mean, it's particular, not that it's unique, because it happens in so many different spaces. But what actually happens, you can see, I mean, if you read the work of Ratele, also the work of Pumla, you read the work of Morel and many others. I mean, masculinity studies are deeper in South Africa, on the African continent, than anywhere else. You know, in fact, many of us got to read masculinity studies by reading them from South Africa first, before applying them to the rest of the continent. And it tells you the ways in which this particular kind of colonial history has produced a particular kind of person and a particular kind of identity. And I think going back, and this is some of the controversial questions and issues that we have. How do we rethink things like initiation schools, you know? What kinds of values do we transmit, you know? What kinds of aspirations do we offer? And what kinds of role models? These are all issues that have been raised. But and this is quite, I think, ironic and a controversial argument is that in order to fix men, they first have to embrace patriarchy, which is very funny, you know, because the entire project is to dislodge patriarchy. But I think you cannot dislodge, in my view, masculinity, because it's so deep and so tough. There are lots of clinics, there are lots of, you know, different projects that are being run. But for me, it's essentially bad. It's an identity which, right from the beginning, just builds itself to be a bad, you know. And the way it becomes successful is just to be bad. And what we need to do is to move people back to values that are deeply embedded in custom, that are deeply embedded in community, that are deeply embedded in care, to be able to change that again, because it means looking out for each other. But it means that we need to be taking people back to tradition, to the things that we call tradition. It doesn't mean, again, I'm not saying that tradition is devoid. In fact, patriarchy is deeply upheld by custom and tradition. But I think we can change that better than we can do with masculinity, because in my view, this particular kind of masculinity that creates this violence in institutions, in values, is because also they're embedded in particular kinds of aspirations that are very problematic. And also in particular kinds of treatment of the other that does not take the other on board. It is, for me, neoliberal and capitalist and modern and post-enlightenment subjectivity is a kind of an identity that privileges the person of our community. And masculinity, in my view, is that particular identity that privileges the individual over community and over others. So being embedded in patriarchy also means that, I mean, and here I'm talking about a particular version, means that you have to be accountable. You need different kinds of accountability that are upheld not by just by young people, but also by elders, and not just elderly men, but also elderly women, by community. But as long as we have subjects or subjectivities or identities that operate and their only accountability is to themselves, we will continue to perpetuate this particular system because there is nothing that holds them accountable. And this particular kind of modern individual that we are creating, and this is the tension because we want to create modern individuals. But at the same time, these modern individuals are very problematic because as Valentine Mudimbe would argue that the colonial library is something that is very difficult for you to escape. You know? And this colonial library is very present, but this is not the only thing to blame because this is a choice that we make. And here, I think that's where, when you ask what should men do, that's a responsibility, you know, to take that choice. You know, the choice is the community, the choice is to care, the choice is to look after others, the choice is to care, the choice. I believe that when you earn the name Abuti or you earn the name Tata or Tate, it means that you have committed to uphold certain values and to care for other people. And I think that's what we need to be pushing for, more and more and more. So the same customs and traditions that we think are problematic, for me, it's a place where we need to begin to return to, you know, in order to solve all of this, because it has tougher accountability than state and many others. So I'm going to end it.
Thanks, Prof. For, I think, a very provocative. You know, I think for me, listening to some of what you bring up, I am excited to be asking some questions. I'm sure that you also have some questions. Please hold those questions, put it down on a piece of paper. We'll have a Q&A session a little bit later. Yeah, I almost wanted to ask my first question already. I also hold off. Our next speaker is Udatile Modise. Udatile is a UCT radio presenter, peer advisor for the academic development program at UCT, and for the SG of the UCT 2023 SRC. He's an alumni of the Becoming Men program piloted by the OIC in 2022, and he's currently the OIC's proxy in the UCT Men Let's Talk series for his residence Kopano. Thanks so much. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you once again for gracing us with your presence. So what I'll be talking about is particularly based on issues that affect young males here at UCT. So the first thing that I would like to touch on is what UCT management needs to know about issues that are faced by young males here at UCT. So the answer to that is, first of all, we come from extremely different backgrounds. A lot of young males feel under pressure to succeed, especially those who come from a disadvantaged background. There's a very serious issue of unaddressed mental health issues that are faced by young males here at UCT. Over the past 2 weeks, I got a call from an ally of mine saying that there was a male student at Lee's Big Residence who attempted suicide. And we had a talk at Ross Common House as well about mental health issues as well. So what basically happened during the talk was a young male confessed that he has also been going through mental health issues, and he nearly attempted suicide as well. So that sparks some light as to this issue of mental health issues is very severe, particularly when it comes to male-bodied students. So there's an element of financial pressure that always comes in the picture. Yeah, and another issue is that there's lack of awareness Some young males might not even be aware that what they're experiencing is mental health issues. So lack of awareness about mental health and its various manifestations can prevent them from seeking help. So another thing that I want to touch on is what are the societal norms which extends pressure to young males? So the answer to that is the societal mainly roles that young males are expected to play put pressure on them, especially if they don't have the means to fulfill those anticipated duties. You know. So when young males are experiencing emotional distress, the stigma associated with mental health issues may deter them from getting assistance, and this may cause a delay in or denial of the support and the care that they need. And another issue is the traditional masculinity norms. So societal expectations often emphasize traditional notions of masculinity, which can discourage emotional expression and vulnerability. So young males might feel under pressure to appear strong, self-reliant, and in control, leaving them to suppress or downplay their emotional struggles. And another element that comes in the picture is the stigma and shame. There is still a significant stigma around mental health in many societies. So young males fear being labeled as weak or unmanly if they don't admit to experiencing mental health challenges. So this fear of judgment and shame can prevent them from seeking help as well. So what I also want to touch on is how do young males understand their relationship with the queer community. So we have young males who accept and support the queer community. So some young males in South Africa are open-minded, accepting and supportive of the queer community. They may have friends, family members, or acquaintances who are part of the LGBTQ plus community and value diversity and inclusivity. So the challenge about that, about the relationship, how young males understand their relationship with the queer community is that there's a social stigma and discrimination. So despite legal protection, social stigma and discrimination against LGBTQ individuals persist in some parts of South African society. So some young males may hold prejudiced views or have been influenced by societal norms that reject or marginalize queer individuals. Another aspect that I want to touch on is cultural and religious influences. So the cultural and religious beliefs can strongly influence attitudes towards the LGBTQ individuals. So some cultural and religious groups may hold conservative views on gender and sexuality, which impact how young males perceive and interact with the queer community. So why is it important for young males to receive education about healthy masculinity? It's one thing that I also want to touch on. So the answer to that is it's important to receive education about healthy masculinity because receiving education about healthy masculinity challenges the harmful stereotypes that comes with GBV. So traditional ideas of masculinity frequently support negative stereotypes that can motivate actions like aggression, emotional restraint, and dominance. So healthy masculinity education works to dispel these myths and encourages a more inclusive and varied conception of what it means to be a man. So another answer to that is it's important to receive education about healthy masculinity because it can help us with preventing gender-based violence. So unhealthy masculinity ideals can influence actions that support unhealthy masculinity ideals can influence actions that support gender-based violence. So young men can learn to develop respectful and non-violent relationships by encouraging healthy masculinity, which will help create a society that is safer and more just. And another thing that I want to touch on is it's also important to receive education about healthy masculinity because it encourages the emotional well-being. So the stereotypical masculinity rules discourage expressing emotions and being vulnerable. So young men who are educated about healthy masculinity are encouraged to acknowledge and embrace a wide range of emotions, which is essential for their mental and emotional health. The last thing that I want to touch on is what is a holistic approach to addressing the interconnected challenges faced by young males here in South Africa and UCT. So it's crucial to acknowledge how complicated and interconnected these challenges are, influenced as they are by historical, social, economic, and cultural factors. A comprehensive strategy that incorporates policy modifications, neighborhood initiatives, educational initiatives, mental health services, and campaigns to advance social inclusion and gender equality is needed to address these problems. So the institution should teach young males about identifying and managing their emotions and encourage open discussions about mental well-being. The university should normalize financial literacy talks. Hence, I said that there's always a financial strain that comes, in the picture. Connect them to resources and sponsors that can assist them with achieving their goals. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Our first speaker has spoken, I think, directly to the idea of power, also values, and also making sense of masculinities, I think, in relation to patriarchy, but also as a subset to that. Our second speaker brings us closer to the idea that young men are struggling with mental health. And in essence, we need to create space for dialogue and engagement, financial literacy, as well as making sense of how religion and culture filters into the current problems we experience. Our third speaker is Daniel Munene. He's currently a senior lecturer and coordinator of the Student Development Services in the Commerce Faculty at the University of Cape Town. Prior to that, he was the head of department of the Education of Development Unit in the Commerce Faculty. The program is aimed at addressing our national goals and the university's policy of promoting equity and excellence at UCT. He's also a sub-warden, or sorry, rather a warden. He's also a warden. He's also a warden of Rio Marquette Hall, largest single tier mill residence at UCT prior to joining UCT. Daniel was the Andrew Mellon Lecturer in Economics at Rhodes University and also warden of Oak Dean House, the only postgraduate residence at Rhodes then. I must say that my colleague is a sub-warden, and so the sub... That's I'm happy with that. Apologies for that. And I think we're excited to have you, and also your expertise on working with students and residents as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And first, thank you all for attending this. As Divine alluded, the graveyard shift is always a tough one after a long day of lectures and later getting into family commitment. It's always, for you guys making it here also illustrates your commitment, but also deep and intricate, I think, connection with the topic that we are handling today. And also to say, I acknowledge at the forefront that, like Divine, I'm not also an expert on issues gender-based violence, but I think it's a topic that we've got to be open to discussion or discussing, and also, especially in the context that we're looking at, and in my role as warden especially, to open up spaces where we can really have open dialogue discussions. And so this endeavor for me really presented an opportunity for us to kind of get this discussion. And I'm also thankful to Divine for accepting the role of being a keynote speaker. And look, I think you did, in fact, at the beginning, I'll do a bit of a response to some of the points you've raised. And I'll also talk to some of the, I think, very crucial points Ontatile has talked to. yeah, so my first thing is a vote of thanks. And then I also have to thank OIC for creating this space. Sian, when you approached me, at that time I wasn't even in South Africa, and then I was like, oh, how are we going to pull this off? And you told me, no, Daniel, when you come back, let's see what we can do. And quickly linked me up with Babalo, and she's been fantastic in setting things up. So in her absence, I have to really acknowledge the deep role she played, and also passing on the baton to Quintin, who's facilitating today. So thank you all. So let me start a bit with our, just a minute of a response, perhaps first to Divine, and then I'll talk to Tati. I think Divine brought up very pertinent issues, and you've really got me thinking, because like Divine, I also came to South Africa for my postgrad studies, just around 2000. And one of the things that struck me was some of the things that you probably also encountered in Botswana. We were also caught up in the height of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and I was in Grahamstown at that time doing my postgraduate, and we were acutely aware of how and what this portended for all of us. Yeah, and then the pathologizing and how you've linked the masculinity and the pathological link that these two concepts kind of bring was always at the back of our minds. So it's fascinating that ultimately I think what you've prescribed is almost going back to our initial conditions, because masculinity in itself comes with that neoliberal connotation, which almost elevates self rather than others, goes against all, I think, our concepts of, for lack of, or if I want to put it just brutally, honestly, Ubuntu, for instance, yeah, because Ubuntu enshrines in it, my otherness is connected to, or my being is connected to other people's being, and this concept is not even peculiar to South Africa or special to South Africa. It resonates across the continent. It actually resonates across many cultures, if you want to call them traditional cultures. If you go to the Middle Eastern cultures, if you go to East Africa, where I come from, if we talk about identifying yourself, if I say I come, say, from the coastal region and I'm Swahili, we speak Swahili in East Africa. So Swahili is the language, but if you want to actually identify as someone who comes from that culture, it's not about speaking the language. It's about having certain norms and respecting certain, to say, etiquettes, which means taking care of everyone around you. It has a social dimension to it, and it almost requires for us to go into a traditional space to look at the best of our traditions. And I think that's part of what I talked to, and Ondatile talked, I think, raised an issue around young men and what we encounter, especially for young Black men. That our traditions, I think, have been pathologized also, that we've only looked at the negative aspects of our tradition. When I think about Leo Marquardt and a lot of young men who come to Leo Marquardt, there's a huge cohort that goes through, for instance, initiation ceremonies. Again, not peculiar to South Africa, because where I come from in East Africa, a lot of our communities go through initiation ceremonies. But what is peculiar about our initiation ceremonies that at times breed a young man who then enshrines violence as part of his being. Because I also went through initiation ceremonies. Nothing about my ceremonies that foregrounded violence as what I was being initiated to. In fact, if anything, it foregrounded responsibility and me almost growing to another level, taking on responsibilities that showed that I cared for the society that I lived, and also gave me a sense of responsibility. And that in itself did not give me the power to violate others. And so when I look at the context we live in, our residences, our initiation processes, what perhaps has been elevated is the negative of our traditions, than looking at what, in fact, within our traditions foregrounded a whole lot of positive elements that we can bring out, which will serve the purposes of actually getting our young men to still have an identity, because I think it's crucially important. When we were talking with Babala, one of the things because we even had a debate about how are we going to frame this conversation, and what are we going to talk to, and who are we going to talk or find who can talk to these issues, and Divine, you came up on the list, so it's not my fault only. You can work on this. But one of the issues I said is, if we don't seek to make young men part of the solution, then, and also acknowledge that they come from societies where they have to feel their identity, they have to feel that they belong to something, because if you don't have your identity, if you don't feel part of a community, if you don't feel that you can say, I am so and so from a certain place, then you've lost part of self. And part of that also leads to issues that we're talking about, mental health, because you're displaced. You don't know how to define yourself. And so for me, part of the solution lies in finding those elements of our traditions, for lack of a better way of putting it, that would elevate the positives and what it entailed to be a young, responsible man, for instance. So that's one of the things that I think I'd like to start with as an opener. And then from a direct context, when I look at a residence situation, 5 minutes already. Wow, time flows quite fast. So let me jump into some of the activities that we kind of foster to try and enshrine this responsible code within the residence. One of the roles that I played when I joined UCT and I joined the residence structure is that I was also requested to join the board of the Sati Bagman Shelter for Women and Children. And very quickly, once I saw the violation of women and the children who are in that home, in that shelter, I realized part of what I might want to do is get my young men who live in residence to see what actually violation does to society, what violation does to their sisters, because the women mostly predominant in that shelter were Black women. And when I say Black, it's broad Black, it's Black, Indian, colored. And 90% of my residence is that. So what we started is initiatives where Makwadians every year would have a mission to go and spend a day there to do some community service, cut the grass, paint the walls, do some what we call social responsibility. And the impact of that was tremendous, because immediately it made sense that, in fact, if we don't enshrine a positive, I think what Otati called a positive masculinity, although we've said there's a pathological connection to masculinity, but if we can find some positive, whether it's through the tradition and all that, but also realize that we actually could be better. And slowly by slowly, the discussion would also be there in race. How can we, and in fact, the House subsequent would say every year, what do we want to do this more than a once a year thing. Now the challenge, and I will also talk to some of the challenges that we have in residence. What are we not doing, or what don't we do right? It became an initiative only for one residence, and when we tried to get our brother residences and our sister residences to join in this initiative, most households would not want to spend their budgets on that. And I felt very sad, because if we were able to go as a community, one, the impact is much bigger, but we also get to see and experience this as a bigger community, which might help, because when GBV happens, it doesn't happen in one locus only. It impacts all society. When one of our brother residences had this incident or perpetration happening 2 years ago, the whole cluster in that space suffered, because it's not, you won't only point on Leo Makwad, you'll also say, but Leo Makwadians interact with so and so, and therefore some of that rubs off on other residences. The other thing that I think that also is important, and I think it also touches on Tatile, what you mentioned, is a culture of inclusion. I found initially when I took over as warden, especially in Leo Makwad, Ogden at Rose was a bit different because it was a postgraduate, predominantly international residence. But Leo Makwad, I found a very jokish culture, and joke culture and the masculinity that comes with it is definitely pathological. It's patriarchal in its outlook. It's about dominance. But dominance also has a very exclusive, and exclusive, I mean excluding others. And so what my first role was to try and shift that exclusion into an inclusive culture. And we looked at small nodes. How can we include? For instance, a simple thing, because 2008, 2009, before we even got into the major incidences that we've seen within the residences of GBV. We had xenophobia, or what I would term as Afrophobia, happening rampantly. And so what I inspired my housecom to do was to start identifying any other citizen in that residence that was not from South Africa and putting up their colors and their flags within the residence so that anyone who lived there felt as part of that community. And slowly by slowly, people in fact would go into the dining hall and ask, what flag is that? Which country? And all of a sudden it was easy to identify that we have a very international, beyond the flags of nations, we went into flags of, the rainbow flag, for instance, the United Nations flag, whichever other community that we identified as excluded became part of that community. Slowly by slowly, it started conversations of inclusion of every other community and I think that helps start conversations around how do we also do the Ubuntu, the sharing, looking at society more than itself. Small other aspects that I think, and part of what I'm touching on is that the small little aspects that we might take for granted that also help in the resident structure. Sports for me was an interesting one. And when I talk of sports, I'm not talking a big sport moment like Madiba and rugby in the World Cup in the 90s. I'm talking about getting sports that traditionally would not have been seen as male sports introduced in res. So whenever my housecom would come initially and they would want me to sign up sport codes, it was soccer, of course, it would be basketball, it would be all masculine type of. And then one year, a certain housecom came and said, what do you want to start to enter into the netball league? Now, first of all, I got a shock because I was like, okay, who plays netball in the residence? And I got inspired to know that there's enough Macquarians who want to play netball, but if it was really floated through the house. And so we entered the league. The first year, of course, we were walloped quite thoroughly. But very fast we became top in that netball league. I was pleasantly surprised. And it's become one of the most fascinating codes or sport codes that is totally embraced in the resident. What it's also opened is conversations that we wouldn't have had about what are masculine sports, what are feminine sports, what are sports that don't care. And so slowly by slowly we are encouraging, do what is best for you, but also include and stop this bounded, in economics call it bounded rationality, where you place silos of certain activities. Finally, I also want to touch on, and I don't know if it came from both Otatile and Divine, it's about role modeling. And I think our society especially has suffered tremendously for lacking positive role models. And I think it's something that I don't have a solution for, but what I've tried within, at least in the residence, and I think which would be lovely if we were able to do as a cluster, is to find ways of, for instance, looking at, because we always look at role models in the higher spheres, the political sphere, but there's certain people who are able to role model, even in small ways, colleagues within the residence structure, people who work in the shelter, for instance, so that you bring people, parental figures, because I think oftentimes we look for a big name, whereas there's someone just within your community who might be able to do a much better job educating the youth. And then the alumni, for instance, that's also another very good role model, because these are people who walk the walls, who've lived the walk, but who also are seeing what society can be if we don't actually get a correcting mechanism to this. And I think I'll stop at that.
Rani from Kruger in the Eastern Cape. Amandla is a third-year occupational therapy student. She's also the current UCT SRC student advocacy representative. Your bio was very shortened, I believe, but we would love to hear your voice. And yeah, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. So my name is Amandla, as I have been introduced. So the reason why I always mention that I've got I want people to know that I have been taught. And I had a practical representation of what I wanted to say. So it's a cup and a towel. I hope you can see. If you can't, just imagine it. So, I wanted a sport, but because I didn't have time to buy one, I took a club. So I always say this: no one has ever told me that I'm inferior to men. No one has ever sat me down and said, Amanda, men are superior than you. And I assume that's the same for men. But this is, I have always known that I'm inferior to men. I don't remember a point in my life where I didn't know that this is my position in my household. And this is because as a young child, that's the most stage where we are vulnerable. So I always use sponges to explain this. Because you see the behaviors in your household, you see the behaviors in a church, you see the behaviors outside your household, in your community. And you see how your aunts, your mother, your sisters behave and how your brothers behave. And you absorb that and it informs you, but this is your position in your household. And it kind of silences you as a young girl. And I always say this, I was silenced for the most part of my life. For 19 years, I've been living in this environment. This is my environment, and I am placed in it, and I'm observing everything that is happening, which is psychosocial. I am learning how to interact with men. I am being conditioned to receive men's violation, and boys are being conditioned to violate me. And in that sense, I get to UCT. They teach me these brilliant terms of patriarchy, coercion, Mr. What? I'm like, I know. I think I'm going on now. And even if I take this education and I try to apply it, you can never take away the fact that for 19 years, I grew up in this environment. Even if you squeeze out the water in me, then only to traces back. I was taught that I'm inferior to men with seeing the behaviors that existed in my household. So even when I got to university and applied to be in this leadership position, I was challenging myself even. I was saying, okay, I know now that I am capable. I'm at UCT for, like, I am capable. So I'm challenging myself, but within the leadership structures too, I am always reminded of, you are still inferior. You can only get to this point, and you are allowed to occupy this certain position. Certain positions are still for male, for masculine people, and it goes back to the thing of, how do we unlearn so much? How do I begin to unlearn so much of my identity as Umxhosa? And how do I go around and say Umxhosa when even that culture in itself is rooted in me being inferior to men and me receiving whatever violence that men are bringing to my table? And I'm doing OT, occupational therapy, and we were taught about psychodynamic therapy in second year, I think. And they said that whatever behavior we exert is a reflection of where we are coming from. And this is why I always say the reason why GBV talks like this more is women is because men teaches men to behave in a certain way, but this is UCT culture. When men go to their backgrounds, where they come from, this culture doesn't fit in home. Even with me, myself, whatever I'm taught, it doesn't fit home. I can be very loud here, I can take leadership position, but I know the minute it's December, the minute I'm taking off that feminist clear tie and going, like, because I can't be always fighting my parents and explaining to them why this is wrong, why. And it's always explained back, it's culture, it's tradition. And as someone who's trying to break away from Western nice custom, I always find myself contradicted. Am I conforming to more westernized custom by rejecting what my parents are teaching me and what I've been taught for the most part of my life? And which goes to, I love what Prof said, the invasion of our cultures. I feel like our cultures have been defined by our adaptive instinct because there was colonization and all of this, and this distraction within the African cultures. We do not know what exactly our culture was what we know is an identity instinct that became our culture because of the environment and the system that existed. And I always see GBV as a system. I look at GBV as a system that produces a type of victims and a type of perpetrators. And in order to break GBV, I feel like there's a lot of work that has to be done, because it's not just a violation, it is an entire system that is so indoctrinated in every institutional system, from the religious system, from the cultural system, from the education system, like economic system, jalo jalo. And I always say, but it's very important that we read about the African culture and find what it meant to be African. And that's also hard because the research that is out there is research that is written by our colonizers. And the research that is out there, you will find out that they are portraying African culture in this sense, and men and black men in this sense. And when you tell someone that they are a violent being for more than 20 years, those people become violent beings. And Chimamanda mentions the danger of single storytelling. Because when you tell someone, but we learn, this is who you are, this is who you are. Even if I was not that, I would end up being that. So we have to reverse a lot of psychological, and we have to emancipate ourselves. Yeah, it's a lot. And yeah, so I think most of my points were covered. We need to find our own identity as Africans, bring Ubuntu. And I don't even think as a society we are ready for a liberal women and empowered women, because the problem is we as a feminist myself, I identify as a feminist, but I always find that I fall a victim of violence. While I know that this is wrong, but I will still find myself falling in. I am violated and I can't survive. It's so deep rooted in our brains and in our mind, and I don't know how we're going to begin to unlearn that, and how the society will ever be, if the society will ever be ready for a liberal woman. And I love what Cross said about men embracing patriarchy. We need to unlearn, we need to acknowledge that this is a system and it exists, and it violates everyone. Everyone is violated by patriarchy, even men themselves. They are not benefiting from patriarchy. No one is safe under that system. So the minute we embrace the system and we acknowledge it, I think we will be closer to unlearning most of the damage that has been done to us. But we can never undo it because it's belief. And yeah, thank you. That's all I
Thank you so much, Wanda. I think it was really powerful. I also hear you make reference to this idea of a lived experiential education, right? Where we come from particular environments without words being spoken, tacit knowledge is almost imposed on us, and we act and we engage with the world through those lenses. Thanks for that. I think that's very powerful. With that being said, I open the floor for questions. I think we take a round of two. If you're online and you want to pop a question, also just raise your hand online. So I see there's two questions, right? So we'll go with you first, and then we go here, and then we'll take the second round. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for this amazing talk. It was really eye-opening, and I felt it is very needed in such times where a lot of attention is being directed towards women, and it's justified. But I feel like this is needed to just fill in the gaps when it comes to men, if that makes sense. My first question would be towards Ontabida and the panel in general. You talked about different types of masculinities that we find in university, and you highlighted the traditional masculinity, which in most circumstances would be a hegemonic type of masculinity and a very violent one. And my question would be, how do you then protect men from each other in the patriarchy and in these different forms of masculinity, with the traditional one being hegemonic and violent. And to Amanda, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Pumla Tola's work on the cult of femininity. But my question would be, do you think that there could maybe be submission expressed by women, or that would still have elements of empowerment and liberal rights? Yes. So do you think women could be empowered and liberal and still be submissive? Because we talk a lot about healthy masculinity, which could translate to healthy dominance. So could we have healthy submission? Please.
So, should I ask?
Yeah, okay.
Hi guys, my name is Daniel. I don't have much to say with regards to my biology, but I spent time in Kopano, with the residents in Tatilizin. I was in Kopano in 2019 during I would say it was a very interesting period in UCT transformation. We did see a lot of developments with regards to that. I was also in Kopano in 2020 and post 2021. One of the things that this is a very personal experience. It's mainly rooted in my experience, especially from, it's mainly rooted in my experience. So firstly, you did mention that you put relationships. And I went through it at a very interesting age. I was like 13, 14 when I went there. I'm Betty and half Ugandan, so I went through the one in Limpopo. But one of the things that I did notice in my sense of initiation school wasn't about violence. It wasn't about much of the modern masculine figure, but it was more about brotherhood. It was more about emotional intelligence and being able to voice out your opinion in a way that doesn't shut down the next person. Mm-hmm. So now coming to a university setting where now they tell you that, oh yeah, this is who you are, take that away from you, and now learn this. And this is one of the things that I actually noticed while I served as a mentor in Kopano. I also served as on another leadership structures. And one of the things that we noticed most of the time when we would have transformation talks, especially from the OIC, is that there is some, I wouldn't say hatred, it's not hatred, it's resistance towards listening, because in listening, it's not them asking you, who are you? It's them telling you who you're supposed to be. And you did speak about the positives of masculinity. And how is it? Yes, it is pathological. But we still have to analyze the positives in order to take out the negatives. Yeah. So, wait, I forgot my question.
You can also comment, it's also okay. So, and we shall comment some more, because I think there's something coming out of that.
So one of the questions that I had was, how do we address, I call it third culture, basically. It's us taking away the individuality that comes from residence people. We have people from different countries, people from Mamelodi, Pretoria, Limpopo, Eastern Cape. We are all men in our own cultures. We have different values. How do we take care of, how do we address the issue of third culture in the residence system where there is suppression of these individual identities? And how it is that this will lead to a negative perspective among young men. How is it that, now is it that we find that there's also the issue about, I come from this type of initiation school. This is what I learned. You are from a different culture. This is what you learned. You get to UCT, they told that you were wrong. They told that you were wrong. Personally, my grandfather told me, I would say, the best type of manliness I ever heard, like growing up. He taught me that as a man, you shouldn't be afraid to cry. As a man, you shouldn't be afraid to seek help when you need help. As a man, you shouldn't be afraid to speak up to the next person, speak up for the next person. These are all values that I see as positives. I come to an environment where they now teach you, as Amanda said, new words like patriarchy, misogynist. I do remember there was a test in Kubani when I got here. They taught us these terms, and you had to pass them, otherwise you didn't out. So it's always these things about you learning these things, but nobody actually asked you, who are you? What did you learn growing up? And so there's like this weird resentment. And even, I'm sure it's even there still, like Kopano, where now if you bring a talk such as this, people will be like, what are these people saying? They never actually asked me who I am. So yeah, sorry. So I think.
We'll take the first round, and then we'll take the second round. There's a question there, there's a question as well. Maybe the responses first.
Okay.
Who starts?
So the question about healthy submission. So this is my view on submission. I think submission is not the problem per se, and that's why I believe there can be healthy submission. The issue is men hold the part that they bring into a relationship or into whatever environment as of high value, which creates the entitlement and hence because of that they don't acknowledge the other person, they don't see the inherent dignity that other people are born with. Dignity is something that you must acquire in their mind. You need to work, I need to see your dignity. And I am, as a man, I bring a lot into the house. Hence, I don't acknowledge umama xa ndimtyele xa ndimsebenzele kuhlamba izitya. So that's a way of submission. Kuhlamba izitya nokuya kwakho emsebenzini, it should be seen as of the same value because you guys are both contributing into this household and you should be treating each other with dignity. So the issue, I feel like the issue is not submission, like the issue is that men feel that they are of high value and they are entitled, and whatever they bring, it's superior than your own, and they can do as they please to the children, to the mother, because they are the hero of the house. So that's what I think.
So in responding to your question, you asked, how do I protect men from the hegemonic nature of their cultures? So considering the fact that we all come from different backgrounds, obviously we consume what we learn from where we come from, you know. So I think creating platforms where men can learn and unlearn certain behaviors in society, that's how men can be protected in relation to, you know, what is it that they need to adapt from now going forward in terms of promoting healthy masculinity?
Yeah. Okay. So I think Daniel was probably more directed towards me, partly also to you. But yeah. So Daniel, I'll try. Your question came out at the end, but I'll also try and figure out part of yeah, and maybe comment to your comment because I think there's a pattern. So I do agree with you to a large extent that there's not enough listening also happening. Even within the residence structure, I think there's a very hierarchical system that seems to know what the value scheme for the residents should be, and almost takes away who that individual is. But the individual is also what makes this family, if you were to call a residence a family, because I look at Marquardt as a family of people who, because you spend more time there during your university stay than most other places. So we try and create that kind of, or imbibe that kind of culture. And so what at times I try to do, and I don't even think we are close to getting it right, but I try to ensure that everyone understands who you are is also important. Your identity is important, and that's why in one of the points I raised was it's important to also be okay with who you are, and also understand where you're coming from. And I think part of the challenge of that is what Amanda talked about, that in trying to figure out who you are and where you're coming from, especially for us Africans, I enjoy myself in that, a lot of our culture has been eroded. And basically massacred because of the narratives that have come about African culture. The pathological aspects of our culture have always been the ones elevated in most of the writings, in most of the, when I look at the colonial architecture, part of what they had to do was necessarily brutalize the person they were colonizing so that the narrative would be like, we had to essentially, what was the word that they used? We had to, there's a word, they had to make us better people. I'll get English at times plays tricks. Pardon?
Not civilized. No.
See the civilization mission, yeah. We're trying to civilize this brutal. So necessarily most of the culture that we've inherited is a culture that's been written wrongly for the most part, a culture that has also been massacred quite a bit, and it almost needs for us to actually go and trace back what were the origins or the original cultural norms that we had, you know. And part of what I do, especially when I go home, is I sit down with my grandmother and I ask her, Grandma, and luckily, you know, she never learned English, she never went to school, so she's able to tell me in my time in the 30s, she knows that time because she'll tell you about a famine that happened then, that was captured, so we know this is what we did pre-colonial, pre-whatever. And then you actually realize there's a lot of nuggets of humanity that actually haven't been captured in anything that I've read post, because the literature I read now just talks to mostly of the pathological. Why am I going into this long terrain? Because then the young men who also inherited their culture after that, the initiation processes that were created, even with the people who, because we had to almost recreate initiation processes, are initiation processes that are led to by this new narrative. And so a pervasive initiation process is created. So back home, what I think most of the elders have done is they've gone to at least the few remaining elders pre-colonial to try and retrace the roots. So a whole lot of the ceremonial processes almost differ from the pathological initiation processes that would be brutish, would be jockish in their manner, because that is exactly what it wasn't. It was about building a community. It's about how we work together. For instance, when we were looking at how to defend our community against war, against famine, against what, so it was a betterment project rather than a reductive project. And I think it's important to always, and I don't see that being separate from you being a better person. So what I try to have is all Makwadians understanding who you are is important, but who you are does not supersede the other. That's the other important point. But just because I went to initiation school doesn't make me better than Ontatile. Whether he went to a school or not, that's not the issue. I must be proud of who I am, and Ontatile must be proud of who we are. And when we are in this community, we build another community that is enshrined on a different value stream. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. There were two other hands. Before we take those hands, just want to add, I think what is very important, you spoke about, a colleague spoke about the idea of, Amanda Gos writes about a feminist ethic of care, right? Mm-hmm. And how we negate the value of care within our households, and therefore we have this idea of entitlement, etc. Just maybe to check that out for further reading. And the second idea is literally about mutual interdependence, right? And so we speak about submission, we speak about dominance. Nico Koopman writes about mutual interdependence. What does that look like when we make sense of that outside of domination or submission in itself? And I think it brings us a little bit further around the type of engagement that we have amongst particular groups. There were two more hands.
There's two on this side. I just want to ask, I think my question is related to my comment. So, learning and unlearning is very difficult. In that, I think Ontatile and Amanda touched on our different backgrounds. The fact that we come here with already having absorbed a lot of ideologies, a lot of beliefs, a lot of a set system of values in our background. So my thing is, and before I go into my question, I want to touch on my Ontatile highlight. We recently, I'm from this league, so we recently had like what I can call a suicide attempt by a male student who is an international student. And when the parents were contacted, because obviously it's a situation, the father was very not nice to his own son. So in that moment, you see how difficult it is for man to actually be able to be what we as society want to portray as good men. Because obviously he's been under the shadow or maybe the lessons of this elder person who happens to be an example to him, that because he portrayed his son as, like the way he responded is like, you're not supposed to be asleep. Like, what is this that you're doing now? That thing that men don't cry, or men don't subject themselves to such, because you're a man, supposed to have your things together. So it was very heartbreaking to witness that as a father who lacked sympathy towards his own son, and then you ask yourself that, okay, so we want to break these patterns and lessons that these people have already had, and we want to adopt that in this UCT system, that like, okay, so this is what you can have learned at home. Here and moving forward, it's not going to work. So this is what you need to do, which then becomes a conflict, which then gives rise to these GBV incidents. So my thing is, I want to know from the panel how we can address the transition from our different backgrounds. That yes, you come here and you learn the big words and you learn all of these things, how you're supposed to conduct yourself. You go to school that teaches you how to sit, how to stand, how to get coffee, open the tap. But then you get home and you still need to use the bucket. And you still need to go to the river. So that is just what I want to understand. Like, how do we now break that? Because at the end of the day, home is where we get the most. Yes, we come here and we do all of these things, but you still go back home. Even after this academic period, even in your career, at the end of the day, the main element of your life is home, the roots. So how do we address the roots, basically? How do we address the roots and heal the roots, because they have weeds now, which is what is hurting us as a society, and we want to address that. How do we now make it easy for them to be able to unlearn whatever they learned from wherever they come from, and learn in a manner that also does not go against the good values maybe that are still left in their cultural, religious, traditional beliefs or communities, but also make them better, healthier beings in a way that helps us as a society coexist. Yeah, I guess that's my question.
There's a, sorry, Sid.
Oh yeah, it's more not mainly like a question, more like a comment. Maybe like if I take it back to, let's say like as like a man, you grow up, you go through like all these things. There's like different stages, preliminary ones you have to get over because certain things you have to do to get in, to fit in. I remember you speaking about like some sense of identity. That's what like most, lacking. It's what we're all looking for like every day. It's pretty hard to find that because most of the time, personally, I don't think I found it, but like I'm very well on my way to that. But like not everyone's like as grounded as I am, and like because their like education, because they're what I noticed is like most of these guys like I hang out with them on a daily, like chill with people, kill people, you don't even know, but they function on the same basis that we all do as men. So like it leads me to think it's like there is a universal truth that like we all know it's unspoken. But the problem is I remember a mention of emotional awareness. And I want to add on like maybe contextual awareness to like situations where you are, what you're doing. Bringing it back, my experience, initiation, I'm not gonna like, you know, but mainly there, what I was noticing was like, it's a lot of peer pressure. You know, that's the main contributor. Peer pressure, not only from your mates, but from the women around you, from people you're socialized by, people you are everywhere by. I was having a discussion, like we speak about these things like as often as we can, but we were speaking about how the patriarchy idea, like it's being adopted like heavily, whether you verbally agree or like you visibly agree or whatever, but like everyone's thinking it, and the problem is there. It's like certain words or like certain things, or stigmas, they only stick if you perpetuate them like they are. And it's very hard to just like tell people, hey man, forget this word, or like, hey man, this didn't happen, which is why like I feel like not unlearning, more so developing on like what is there, what could be there. And the problem with that is every approach I've noticed, it's either one of two, it's too aggressive or too soft, or if it's not too soft, people like just don't care like at all, because there's only like two positions that like really you can take as a man. I don't know. I also feel like we need to establish like as men, like what is this thing? What is a man? Like who is this guy that I'm supposed to be? You know, one day I'm gonna have like 2, maybe 3 of these guys looking up to me. I don't know who they're looking at because I didn't know growing up. The people growing up, they weren't teaching me, because how's my mom gonna teach me how to be? You know, if you're lucky, you're gonna have a dad. Sure. But like, not all of us are going to, you know, I'm trying to rub that in everyone's faces, circumstances they don't allow. But the main issue is I feel like it's the education, it's lacking, it's the role models, it's all that. Yes, they come in a bundle. But it always boils down to the education. How are you going to teach this? Because it's either, if the father's not there, like he's grown up with his mom, maybe the mother's just as confused, doesn't know, you know, or if you're not grown up with the mom, you're grown up with an uncle or something, you know, like, it's just things like that. You're supposed to be able to grow up to be a functioning adult, regardless of whether like you're a male or not, regardless of the situation, whether you're grown up with grandma, uncle, whoever. You're supposed to come out a functioning person. So now I think we need to find where the disconnect is there. And I feel like it's in the fundamentals, education.
Oh no, I just had a comment that I think it was your question and comment. It reminds me of a lecture we had first year. Lushaba said, we as Africans, we come, you know, back from different backgrounds, back at home in Eastern Cape, wherever. We come to these institutions and we are going to consume all this knowledge, the big words, and we will go home with our, you know, Western and Eurocentric knowledge, and to go question our traditions. For example, the unlearning that, for example, this is how you should treat a man. Then when you question that, it's like, oh, you know better now, because, you know, it's like you're trying to question your entire traditions. So all of these comments remind me of that lecture, and also what I've been reading on about the episteme side and culture side, basically the massacre of our traditions and culture. And also really liked the ubuntu, the care, the responsibility, you know, as well as ubuntu, care, responsibility, and interdependency that was brought up. And I think that is really important, you know, when it comes to these conversations.
Shane, are there no other questions? I know we still have to respond to that particular question to the panel. Is there a hand there?
Yes. Yeah. We have just, with the comments and the discussion as well, touched on Eurocentrism. I think Prof. Divine mentioned the existing colonial library. And the thing is, with a lot of written work, a lot of practices tend to be codified. And in them being codified, they become stagnant. And so you find that there are these practices that exist in archives and in written work that are there and being stagnant, and you find that there are living practices that are more flexible and more progressive, and there exists this dichotomy, if that makes sense, between what is written and what is being lived by people. And so when it comes to the masculinity, would we consider written work, even though it does stagnate the progressiveness of masculinity, but could we maybe use it to make masculinity progressive in the living practices side?
Yes, I think so.
I think I just have a small response to that question. So I think I feel like men need to realize that their value in the family home, in the family structure, is not only finance. Because I find that if men don't have money, they move away from the family and they don't stay within the structure of the family. In psychology, we speak of a secure base, and a secure base is rated for a child when when the child receives both attention from parents, and that child is likely to grow into a functioning adult. So most of us are coming from broken families where the father was absent. We had to beg your father to come to school. You had to beg your father to see you. So we find that as the black students that are here, you meet your fellow other, your counterparts, and they're telling you about how amazing their parents were, and you can see how they turned out because their parents were there for them, even if there was not enough money at home. But being present is so important. And if we aim as the generation that knows, I feel like we know better. We have to find a way to forgive our parents because even our parents, they're at those positions because they are parents, they have parents. So in order to break the generation, we need to do better for our children by being there for them, aiming to create that secure base. I don't know how we're going to unlearn culture, but in terms of just creating individuals that are functioning within the society that will treat other human beings with dignity, we need to treat our children with dignity and respect at a very young age and model that so that they consume that and they're able to see human beings in that lens.
Yeah, there are lots of very important questions and also contributions, and I also enjoyed. I think some of many of the responses that colleagues have offered are quite deep. I'm going to respond in many ways. The first is just like, why are you alive? But questions to ask, why are you alive? Do you exist because you want to aspire? Or what's your purpose for existing? And that's a very important question to reflect upon. Because if we don't reflect upon that question, we really have no purpose. And I think that's a question that is challenging us. I think we are alive because we need to preserve life. That's very important. And we need to preserve life, we need to preserve community, and we need to preserve nature. And that means that seek to preserve and protect that. The other is that it's not different from Europe and Europeans. In fact, I've never seen a society, European society, that takes family more seriously than any other. So the idea that the West does not take family seriously is an imagination. The very reason why the West really succeeds is because they take family so seriously. In December, everybody wants to go home for Christmas. Not because they want to go celebrate, but because on the 24th of December, everybody is sitting and having dinner together. In Europe, on the 24th of December is a period where they have the highest murders. But why? Because that's when family comes together and lots of people have quarrels. People travel from all across the world, but they will not miss the 24th of December. And it will be the same in this town. In this town, which is dominated by, of course, I mean, those are the public that we see, by Europe, 24th of December, in this town, see where people are. They are with family. Culture is very important. Custom is very important for this particular community. What has happened is that we have taken the culture of a particular elite as the ideal, which is not a dominant. In European society, not everyone goes to university. The university is a very small elite. Most people, working class or many others, and I mean, I grew up in a home, my father never read to me. My father never read to me. My mother never read to me. It doesn't mean they didn't care about me. But, you know, it's funny, I've never seen it as a problem, you know, but I invested very deeply in reading because I had a community of friends who really privileged reading, you know, and I really wanted to orient to read, but it didn't mean that others who didn't read were not better people. Because I have friends who became carpenters, friends who became mechanics, and who became something else, but we have privileged reading as the most important human. So I think we really have to think again, and that's why what you were saying about embracing culture is important. But it's not because culture is absolutely good. It's just that we need to be grounded in something that allows a community to be accountable. Accountability is very important to solve a problematic, behavior. So if you don't have a community of people who hold someone accountable, we have a big challenge. And the modern world has become an escape. It doesn't mean it's good. It's just that you hear that, you know, I'm doing this because of this, you know. I mean, what kind of man do you want to be? It's something that you have to ask. What kind of man do you want to be? There's a large group of different groups of men that you want to be, but is the man that is beating another person, the man who is violating another person, the man who is not allowing another person to speak, is that the man you want to be? That's a choice that you make. Of course, there are other intervening variables, but that is a choice that you make, you know, and you have to take responsibility for that choice. And then you have all other aspects, you know, for it. Lastly, I would say, I'm a parent. I don't know how many people here are parents. I'm a parent, and gosh, it's such a challenge. You know? And I know we live in a world in which it's all kinds of challenges and lots of things happen, and we are parents in many different ways. You know, each person is a parent in a different way. But I'm telling you, being a parent is something really challenging. You know? And you're very worried. What is my child going to become? You know, if you're committed, you know, if you're committed, you're caring, you're wondering, what's my child going to become? When I first heard that we were going to have a boy, I cried because I was saying, what world is this boy going to come into? And I don't have the, how do you call it, the accountability frameworks. Today I understand why my parents forced me to go to church. They couldn't hold me. I was such an active boy that they needed me to fear something. You know, and they sent me to church and I feared this imaginary being called God, you know. And I can see why they forced me. I came back during the holiday. They said I must go to holiday classes. I must go and learn to weave. I must go and learn to do this. I did lots of other stuff. But I can see the challenge. But the problem is that I don't trust that community, church, school is going to instill the same values that I have. The values that I'm instilling in my child, school is changing. The values that the school is instilling, church is changing. So we don't have, as a collective, the same kinds of values that should allow us to create respectable humans. Because when you're creating a person who is caring in one space, is moving into another space, and they're telling that person you have to be something else. And I think investing in the decolonial project doesn't necessarily mean that we become bad people, but that we go back just first to understand who we are. And then secondly, to begin to shred of the stuff that is really problematic with who we are. Because there's no such thing as tradition as constant. Tradition always changes. We are a people who have always borrowed from one custom to the other. We are people who are people of encounter. So anybody who says that something was fixed and constant is lying. It has always changed and improved. And that's what we're supposed to do.
So, yeah. I'll try and have a shorter response. First things first is to just go back to perhaps what this series of the endeavor was defining, what men should do or could do differently. And from a race perspective, I tried and focused on some of the few things we can do or we've been trying to or attempted to do. But I think one of the fundamental things that I think we also have to kind of frame right is we've got to also make young men part of the solution and not always define them as the source of the problem. Because I think there's parts of me that always feel that whenever we have a discussion around GBV, it's the source of the problem that as part of the solution. And I think that's why I agreed to this endeavor, because I think that's part of what we're doing. We're having a conversation about how we can also be part of the solution. Then the second thing resonates with what Divine has just talked to, that who are we? What defines you, me, us? And what gives you a sense, and it's not purely a sense of identity, but what is your reason for existence? In French, they call it what? Raison d'être. Yeah. And why that's important is because it almost ties to one of the issues that Otati talked to, that society and the societal roles for men in the current neoliberal context have become very brutal. It's a very competitive world out there. There are no jobs, financial distress everywhere, mental health challenges. So we almost have to frame for ourselves, amidst all this, what is important for you, or what is important for us. Which therefore means that even when you're looking at the job or the job cultures, I come from, you had part of my history is I'm an economist for training, for my sins, and I worked in banking before I came into education. And I remember the brutality of working in banking. It's a totally, and I know in this context it might sound odd, it's a man-in-man society. You rise because you've cannibalized someone else. You've made profits because you've been able to take business from someone else. You are making a deal in financial markets, necessarily when you short, which means that you make profit out of a certain position, someone has to lose for that to happen. So it's a brutal society, you know. But after a couple of years of that, and I was fairly successful in that, I realized that was what it wasn't giving me, it wasn't giving me pleasure, it wasn't giving me satisfaction in a deep sense. You know, I was making the money, but it wasn't giving me something that I yearned for, you know, a sense of fulfillment. And I think that's part of what we almost have to go back to. What makes you, so what are you good at? What can give you a sense of fulfillment? What will pay the bills? Because that's also important. But does that pays the bill mean that you have to brutalize someone else? And I think that's what we are, because most of the situations we are almost push us to spaces where you pick on roles that will brutalize others for you to do it. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So I'd like to address the question that one of the girls asked. How do we address their needs? So I think it all goes back to education. I think it's up to us, those of us who are privileged to be conscientized about positive aspects of life. It's up to us to share them with our family members, you know. But then the challenges that you need to consider is not everyone in my family who's going to accept what I know, you know. So, for example, we come from different backgrounds, right? And everyone in our families have like different personalities based on how they grew up as well, you know. So how they take what I'm telling them will be different from how they experience life and how they view life as well, you know. So I think that's one thing that we need to consider as well. But I think it's up to us really, as those who are conscientized about positive knowledge, to really share with our family members. And one thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what are the resources that are available in our communities in terms of addressing these issues as well? Yeah.
Thanks so much. I think we are close to finishing, and I'm going to ask our panelists to give a last word, and it will be centered on where to from here, in your view. Yeah? But before I do so, I just want to respond to, I think there was a question from one of our colleagues asking about literature and practice that doesn't quite come together quite well. Maybe just an idea from the Decolonial Project is to ask whether or not our curricula, in a sense, is responsive to our contexts, right? We often come to institutions, into spaces which the curricula was not developed for your benefit, it was developed for the benefit of Eurocentric vision, right? And so often we are educated and we are actually asked and we're deployed to serve and to solve Eurocentric problems. The question is, will we ever solve African problems if we stay within that mold? And I think it's important to centralize and to bring to the center context. And you were part of that solution in really bringing that to the type of literature we have currently. And then my last remark before, as a provocation to our panelists, is to ask, I think, Deiko says we are what we think. James Smith says we are what we desire, right? At an affective level, all our behaviors, the ways we engage with life, is shaped by what we desire, right? Our fulfillment. That being said, if we are desiring power, right, or we are desiring a particular lifestyle, our ways of doing and being, in a sense, is always going to be in the interest of myself and not the other. And I asked the question, where to from here then? If we have to think about masculinities, or to think about patriarchy, or to think about our communities, where to from here in terms of that type of formation within our society? Start on this end, I think. We always are starting on that. Is it funny? Perfect.
No, look, I can start on this one. So that, yeah. I think for me, and because my focus is within the REST cluster and within our student affairs, there's a couple of places that I think we could do something differently, at least within the UCT's community. One, I think we need to have a lot more of these discussions. Before the roads must fall, fees must fall movements, 2015, 2014, 2015, 16. In fact, the agitation started much earlier than that, 2012. That's when I could feel a swell within the residents that was telling me there's something not, you can feel the agitation happening. And so we started something called the backward impeachment. And we started inviting the high command of the university. At that time, we had the registrar here, we invited Max Price, Tadabantu Shikapo. And part of the conversations were some of these conversations, but it was about what is making this place comfortable for a lot of our African, because most of the issues were around African students coming and feeling displaced in this place. So my point is, we need to open up those spaces again for regular discussion series, open, honest discussions, but even more important, take points and see how we can develop. If we had implemented some of the Inviso points that came out in 12 and 13, we probably wouldn't have gotten to the point where statues had to be plucked off their rostrums to make a point. We probably wouldn't have had to ban all manner of paintings and stuff to make the point. But ultimately it got to that because we'd have these talking spaces and nothing would happen. And that even creates more angst. So I would propose, at least in the residence structure, having more discussions of this nature. And then with the points that we get there, seeing how we can implement them as best as we can. Yeah. And at least that's why I accepted to be part of this discussion, to see that we've started at this engagement.
Just to add a little bit on what you were saying, I think what we also need to consider is, okay, fine, we can try and come up with these initiatives, but sometimes the challenge that we may face is it's not everybody who will show interest, you know, in terms of engaging in these things. Not because the institution is not willing to address these issues, you know, but it's sometimes just the ignorance of people in general. So yeah.
I think one more issue is that, so I'm going to name some races that I know that have high sexual harassment cases. It's Roscommon, Kopano, the last time I checked, and is it Leo? But yeah,
Put it up there.
Roscommon, Kopano. Don't you know what's here?
Yes, yes.
I think it's Leo. And
It's not
it's
Leo.
not Leo.
I'm happy to take that one.
But
We're not as bad as we talk.
But okay, the point is, when I heard about that and I looked at this res, I was like, who are the people that stay in this res? Where do they come from? And I always say that it is important who stands in front of students and teaches them. And the problem we have here at UCT is that already this cohort of people don't feel like they belong at this institution by just arriving at this institution. And then we bring in people that do not relate to them to teach them things that are questioning their identity further. So it is very important who stands in front of students and teaches them. And that person must relate to the student. The person must have information. The person must feel like home for the students so that they feel safe to even bring up and open up about the deep issues that they are facing. And another thing that I wanted to say was to speak to the fact that at UCT, most students are in survival mode. They don't have time to stop and learn. They are barely surviving. We are tired. We are really tired as UCT students. And to expect students to even have time to breathe and focus on their mental health and come to this and take this knowledge and apply it. I feel like we need to relieve our students so that they can focus on other pillars of their life and have time to find themselves within this diverse space. Because the thing is, Mam Eleran said that when you don't belong at a place, no one notices when you are lost because they don't know you fairly, so they don't acknowledge you. So a lot of us are lost in the space. And the thing is, now when we go back home, we are also lost at home too, because when you are in a situation, you don't see what is wrong about the situation. But the minute you go out of it and you can see things from outside, and you are the only person who is seeing all these problematic things that are happening in your household, we are lost. We don't have time. We are tired. We don't belong anywhere. We are just
slow scene. So it's, but one thing I want to say is that it's important to speak to students. It's important to teach a student representation really matters.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what to say. Really. The thing is that I like what you said, Amanda, that it's a totalizing process. It's a totalizing phenomenon, which means that it is.
The university is very important, but it's like you said, it's also an episode in our lives. Because once you cross this and you go down, the person who is driving the combi may have come here but has not been here. And it is reproduced there. When you get into the shop, the person is reproduced there. When you go out in the soccer fields, reproduced there. So this is an aspect of a broader community, and we should not forget that it's not just about the university, it's also about the things that are happening outside and people that are also outside. And that's what we raise as a challenge. You know, how do you reconcile being inside and being outside and navigating those two worlds? And I think that what we say about role modeling is something that we have to really think seriously about. And in many ways, why is it more perverse or deep in this space in which we are? Because there are also students elsewhere who have a lot of challenges, you know, and we need to understand this